Don't touch her! The words tore from Tobias McClum's throat like thunder rolling off a canyon wall. In that scorching afternoon light, with dust swirling and the stink of livestock thick in the air, the sound of his voice cracked through Bitter Creek's stockyard like a rifle shot. All eyes turned. The girl had been no older than 5. Tangled blonde hair, dirt-streaked cheeks, a pale blue dress torn at the shoulder. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest like it was the last soft thing left in the world. Her lips were trembling, eyes wide with animal fear as 2 deputies reached for her from the pen. And that's when something inside Mac snapped. He'd been a ghost for 20 years, a shadow on the edge of town. People still called him Mac, but the man they remembered was long buried beneath whiskey and grief. He hadn't raised his voice in over a decade, but now he moved. 6'4" in his worn boots, his broad shoulders hunched forward like an old grizzly just coming out of hibernation, Mac surged through the crowd. His battered brown cowboy hat shaded pale blue eyes that burned like desert lightning. The first deputy never saw it coming. Mac's fist connected with his jaw, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. The second drew his sidearm, but Mac was faster. He grabbed the man by the collar, yanked him clean off his feet, and growled into his face. "You want to draw on me, boy. You better not miss." "Because I won't." The pistol clattered to the ground. Mac tossed him aside like trash and vaulted over the split-rail fence into the pen. The children inside flinched, some cried out. But the little girl just stared up at him, her tiny hands still wrapped around that doll, her body shaking like a leaf in a storm. He knelt beside her, slow and careful. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you now." Then he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest, the doll crushed between them. She didn't fight, didn't even speak, but she held on with all her strength, her little arms tight around his neck as he turned to face the chaos behind him. Sheriff Murdoch was already yelling from his auctioneer's perch. "Kill that bastard! That's a federal asset he's carrying." The buyers' suits from back east, ranch barons from Mexico, men with money and dead eyes scattered like roaches. But Murdoch's men were drawing weapons, shouting, moving to block the exits. Mac didn't slow down. He sprinted through the gate, the girl in his arms. A bullet whistled past his shoulder. Another kicked up dust at his heel. He ducked behind a hay cart, then sprinted for the alley behind the stockyard, hoisting the girl higher and shielding her with his body. His horse waited near the loading pen, an old bay gelding named Bramble. Mac swung into the saddle one-handed, the girl tucked against him and spurred hard. Behind them, shouts rang out. Shots cracked. The town of Bitter Creek watched from behind curtained windows as the giant cowboy galloped down Main Street with a stolen child in his arms and fire in his eyes. 20 years ago, Tobias McClum had lost everything. And now, with a single act of reckless courage, he'd just declared war on the men who built their kingdom on the sale of stolen innocence. That morning, he'd meant to keep his head down. He hadn't meant to save anyone. He hadn't meant to be seen. But something had changed. It started with an old rumor, half mumbled by Jeremiah Pike, the blacksmith, over morning coffee at the Broken Wheel Saloon. "There's something wrong going on at the pens," he'd said. Miguel heard kids crying, wagons coming at night, new buyers in town clean boots, too soft for cattle. Mac had barely grunted in reply. Just stared into his whiskey, the cheap kind that burned going down and dulled the ghosts behind his eyes. He'd thought of his daughter Emma, like he always did, and the doll they'd buried with her after the accident. Sophie. That damn doll still visited him in dreams, always clean, always smiling, while Emma cried somewhere he couldn't reach. "You ever think about fixing up that ranch house?" Ida Perkins, the saloon owner, asked him, same as she always did. No point. But something about today had been different. The way the wind shifted, the smell in the air, the way Miguel Santos wouldn't meet his eyes when Mac passed him in the alley. So he went, just to look, just to be sure. And what he saw turned his blood to ice. Children, in livestock pens, dozens, some too young to walk without help, dirty, bruised, hollow-eyed, and an auction platform where men in fine clothes inspected them like breeding stock. Murdoch, standing tall and fat and smug, calling out bids like he was selling beef. Lot number 7. Look at this one, boys, 10 years old, strong back, good teeth. And then they brought out the girl in the pale blue dress. She didn't scream, just stood there, holding her doll, like the only way she could survive was to pretend she wasn't really there. Something inside Mac came apart. He didn't remember drawing breath, didn't remember crossing the fence. Just that one sentence echoing from his chest like thunder. Don't touch her. And now they were riding hard across open desert, cutting between scrub and dry creek beds, hooves pounding over sand and stone. The girl clung to him, her cheek pressed to his chest, still silent, still trembling. It's all right, he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. You're safe now. I've got you. He rode until the town disappeared behind him in a haze of dust and sun glare, until the shouts grew faint, until even the crows stopped following. At last he reined in beneath a red rock overhang, a place he knew from his drinking days. A cave half hidden by brush, cool and dark, safe. He slid from the saddle, still holding her, and ducked inside. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared up at him with those enormous eyes that didn't trust anyone, not even him. He laid her gently on a bed of sand and pine needles, then sat a few feet away, gave her space. I ain't gonna hurt you, he said softly, I swear. She blinked at him, clutched the doll tighter. He reached into his shirt and pulled out something small, a brass compass tarnished and dented. The needle still pointed true. He placed it gently on the ground between them. My daddy gave me that when I went off to war, he said it'd help me find my way home. The girl didn't move. It still works, been through a lot, but it still knows where home is. He looked at her then, really looked. What's your name, sweetheart? Silence. That's okay. You don't gotta talk. Not yet. A flicker. Her lips moved. He leaned closer. Juniper, she whispered, like the tree. He smiled, soft and broken. That's a strong name. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the desert in gold and blood-red hues. Night was coming, and with it, the hunt. They would come for her, the men with money, Sheriff Murdoch and his deputies. Maybe worse. Mac looked down at Juniper, now curled in the dust, her doll in one arm, her small frame rising and falling with shallow breaths. He'd spent 20 years wishing he'd died in that wagon crash. 20 years hiding from the world, believing there was nothing left to save. Now, he had one chance to get it right. And this time, by God, he wasn't gonna let another child get taken, even if it killed him. The desert didn't forgive. It swallowed mistakes whole and burned regret into your skin. Mac had known that for most of his life. But that morning, with a 5-year-old girl cradled in one arm and Bitter Creek behind them like a dying memory, he realized he'd never truly understood it. Juniper hadn't made a sound since they'd fled the stockyard. Not when the horse galloped hard across dry riverbeds. Not when gunshots echoed behind them. Not even when he whispered to her that she was safe. The girl clung to him like a rag doll, small arms wrapped around his neck, her breath shallow against his shirt. Her pale blue dress, streaked with dust and blood, fluttered against the wind like a tattered flag of surrender. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. He could feel that in her tiny grip. They rode until the sun was cruel overhead, blazing down like it meant to test them. Mac guided the old bay gelding off the trail, cutting across flats no sane rider would choose. He wasn't trying to outrun Murdoch's men anymore. He was trying to vanish. By mid-afternoon, he found the place he'd once stumbled on during a 2-day bender long ago. Nothing but stone, sagebrush, and a slit in the red rock. A cave, half hidden behind wind-bent scrub. He hadn't seen another soul here in 15 years. He slid down from the saddle and landed hard, knees creaking. The girl didn't stir, just buried her face deeper into his neck. He pulled the horse's reins over a scrub branch, then ducked into the shade with her in his arms. Inside, the cave felt like stepping into a secret. Cool, damp air kissed his face. Dust hung in slanted beams of light from a hole in the rock ceiling. There was an old fire ring, long cold. A shallow pool collected in the back corner from spring seepage. He'd survived 3 days in here once with a bottle and no will to live. Now he was back, but this time he wasn't alone. He laid her gently on a bed of pine needles and sand near the wall. She curled into herself immediately, knees to chest, clutching the doll tighter. He gave her space. "You thirsty?" he asked. No answer. He pulled the canteen from his belt and set it near her, not too close. Then backed off a few paces and sat. Just sat. Let the silence settle between them like dust. She didn't drink, just watched him with wide, haunted eyes. He didn't blame her. Someone had taught her that men were danger, and life had done the rest. Mac looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused. The same hands that once held a baby girl named Emma a lifetime ago. He'd lost her to a wreck on a forgotten trail, lost his wife to fever not long after. Or so he'd believed. Maybe the truth had been darker. Maybe he'd just been too broken to ask the right questions. "You got every right not to trust me," he said quietly. "But I meant what I said back there. I ain't gonna let nobody hurt you again. Not while I'm breathing." She blinked, said nothing. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small brass compass. It was tarnished now, the lid worn smooth by years of fingers brushing over it like a talisman. He clicked it open and let it rest on the ground between them. "This belonged to my father and his father before him," he said. "Carried it through the war, through the hard winters. Always pointed north. Always helped us find our way back home." She stared at it. The needle trembled slightly before settling. He nudged it a little closer. "You want to touch it? You can. Or don't. That's fine too." She didn't move, just kept looking. Mac leaned his head back against the stone and closed his eyes. He was tired, clear through. Bone tired. But he didn't dare sleep, not yet. He could still feel the thrum of hoofbeats somewhere behind them. Murdoch wouldn't stop, not with the kind of money riding on that girl. That whole damn stockyard reeked of something bigger than just backroom corruption. This was a system, a pipeline. "They branded her like cattle," he whispered to no one. The girl flinched. He opened his eyes. She was still watching the compass, but something in her posture had changed. Less coiled, less afraid. He didn't move, just waited. Minutes passed, then soft as breath, she reached forward and touched the compass, just one finger brushing the brass casing. He held his own breath. She looked up at him. "What's it say?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It says we're heading the right direction." She stared at him a long moment, like trying to decide if he was lying. Then, after another long silence, her voice came again. "My name's Juniper." The sound of her name hit him like a sunrise through storm clouds. Small, beautiful, stubborn. Something that grew in harsh places against all odds. "Juniper," he said softly. "That's a strong name." "You hungry, Juniper?" She nodded almost imperceptibly. He pulled a strip of dried jerky from his saddlebag and tore a small piece off, placing it on a clean square of cloth near her. She didn't grab for it, just waited, then reached slowly and took it, holding it like a treasure. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Gone." He didn't press. "That doll got a name? Sophie." His heart stuttered. That was the same name as his daughter's doll. Same age, same name, same eyes. But no, that was coincidence. Had to be. "You did real good back there," he said, holding on like that. "You were brave." She looked at him, really looked. "You're not like the others." "No," he said, "I'm not. You're big." That made him chuckle. "Yeah, I get that a lot." "You talk quiet," she said. "Guess I don't have much to say anymore." She chewed her jerky in silence for a while, then leaned back against the stone, pulling her knees up again. "Are we hiding?" "Yeah, sweetheart. We're hiding. From the sheriff? From a lot of bad men. Are they coming?" "Probably. Will they find us?" "Not if I can help it." She nodded slowly, her little face tilted toward the ceiling where sunlight flickered through the rock. Her eyes were still too wide for a child, but she didn't look like prey anymore. "You got a home?" she asked. "Had one." "Not sure it's there anymore." "Will I have one?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, small, battered, brave, and thought of the photo still hidden in his pocket. Emma, age 7, missing teeth and wild curls, and Catherine smiling even though the shadows under her eyes told him she already knew something was wrong. "You got one now," he said finally. She blinked. "Where?" "Right here," he said, "with me." She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. A soft breath escaped her lips. And then, for the first time, she slept. Mac sat there, rifle across his lap, staring at the compass that had brought him through hell and halfway back. The needle pointed north, but he wasn't heading home. Not yet. He was heading toward war, because something was wrong in Bitter Creek. Deep wrong, and that little girl, she wasn't just a victim. She was the crack in the dam. He knew it then, with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. They hadn't just stolen Juniper. They had stolen his daughter, too. And if he was right, if the whispers and shadows he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget were what he now suspected, then the past wasn't buried. It was hunting him. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to face it. They rode under cover of night, the desert wind brushing over them like dry whispers of warning. Mac kept the horse slow and steady, every hoofbeat muffled by the sand. Juniper dozed against his chest, small and feather-light, her grip on his shirt never loosening. He didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, but because silence felt like the only safe thing between them now. By dawn, the rocky cliffs gave way to rolling grassland, then to the scraggly edge of Bitter Creek's outer reaches. He didn't take the main road in. Instead, he looped around the hills, dismounted behind the old adobe chapel on the east ridge, and led the girl on foot through a back trail only a handful of people in this town even knew. One of them was Elijah Brennan. Doc Brennan had been in Bitter Creek longer than anyone. A war medic turned frontier healer, Brennan treated ranch hands and saloon girls with the same tired, sharp-eyed compassion. He lived in a squat wood and stone house behind the church, his windows always open to the breeze and bad news. When Mac knocked, it wasn't a question, it was a need. The old man opened the door slowly, his wiry frame framed by lamplight and shadows. "Well, hell, Mac," Brennan said, adjusting his spectacles. "I thought you were done with this town for good. Guess I thought the same." Brennan looked past Mac's shoulder, saw the girl half hiding behind his leg, clinging to his long duster coat. "That for real?" Brennan asked, voice lowering. "She's hurt," Mac said, "needs looking at, not just on the outside." The doctor didn't ask another question, just stepped aside and waved them in. Inside was the same as Mac remembered, shelves of bottles, herbs drying in bunches, the scent of pine tar and tobacco thick in the air. Brennan cleared a table and lit a second lamp. "Sit her there. I'll be gentle." Mac crouched, whispered something into Juniper's ear. She hesitated, wide eyes flicking between the men, then climbed slowly onto the table, clutching her doll. It was then Maria Santos appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. Her long braid swung over one shoulder, and her eyes immediately found the child. "Madre de Dios," she murmured. "She's just a baby." "Maria, this is Juniper," Mac said. "She helped raise half the kids in this town," Mac added softly to the girl. "You can trust her." Maria didn't speak. She just smiled and pulled up a stool beside the child, humming something in Spanish, a lullaby Mac remembered faintly from long ago. Brennan gently lifted the sleeve of Juniper's dress. Bruises darkened her upper arms in uneven blotches, old ones, yellow and green, new ones deep purple. On her legs the same. But it was her left wrist that made the room go still. There, burned into her skin just above the bone, was a perfect ring, smooth and cruelly even. A brand. The air turned colder somehow. Brennan looked up at Mac, his jaw tight. "That ain't a stove burn." "I know. It's deliberate, professional." Mac nodded once. The girl didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just sat there, her doll in her lap, looking at a spot on the wall. Maria reached for her hand, tears in her eyes. Who would do such a thing? People with power. "And coin," Mac answered. "The kind who think children are property." Brennan sighed and leaned back, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already stained. "This ain't the first time I've seen marks like that." Mac turned to him sharply. "What do you mean?" Brennan exchanged a glance with Maria. She nodded. 2 years ago, a boy came through, about 10. Mule driver found him near death by the riverbed, said he'd run from a ranch north of here. Had a mark just like this. Same spot, same size. What happened to him? Gone by morning. Disappeared. Thought maybe he wandered off. But now it makes sense, Maria finished for him. They take the ones no one looks for, the ones no one will miss, or think to ask about, Brennan added grimly. They brand them, like cattle. Mac's fists curled at his sides, his jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind. "Why haven't you said anything?" "Said to who?" Brennan snapped. "Sheriff's in Murdoch's pocket. Town council too scared to speak. When you left, there weren't many left with a spine." Maria touched Mac's arm gently. "This isn't just a bad man with a dark soul. It's a system. Organized, clean, hidden in daylight. You can't just shoot your way through this." "I ain't planning to," Mac said. "But I'm also not planning to walk away." Juniper looked up at him then, not with fear, but with something else. Hope. Brennan sighed, running a hand through what was left of his gray hair. "I've heard rumors. Out past Burnt Hollow. Old ranch that got bought up by out-of-town investors. Fancy place, new fences, no branding irons registered, but lots of riders coming and going. And shipments, always shipments. What kind? Crates. Night deliveries. No cattle, no grain, just wagons that leave with nothing but come back empty. You think they're keeping kids there?" Brennan didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Maria wiped Juniper's forehead with a cool cloth. "She should stay here tonight, get some rest. Eat. I'll stay with her." Mac hesitated, then nodded. "I need to ask around. Quiet-like. You'll draw attention. I hope I do." Brennan grabbed his arm before he reached the door. You sure you want to go down this road again? Last time nearly cost you your life. It already cost me my family, Max said. Maybe this time I can do something that matters. And with that, he stepped out into the night. But before he could take 2 steps from the porch, a bullet whined past his ear and slammed into the doorframe beside him. He hit the dirt, gun drawn in a flash, scanning the darkness. From the far ridge, a shadow on horseback vanished into the trees. They knew he was back, and they were already watching. The ride was long and silent, the kind of silence that settles in deep and carries weight. Mac led Juniper through a narrow ravine, the path barely visible beneath the layers of dust and wind-blown stone. The morning sun was already climbing high, but here in the cracks of the mountain, shadows clung like old secrets. At the edge of the ravine, nestled beneath a bluff of crumbling granite, the mouth of the old silver mine yawned open. Forgotten. Abandoned. But Mac remembered it, back when he was younger, before the war took his friends and his quiet nature hardened into solitude. He'd helped dig some of the initial shafts for Old Man Wexler's silver operation, but it never struck rich, and Wexler pulled out fast, leaving behind timbers and tools and rumors. Rumors that kids had been brought here. For work, they said. For shelter, they whispered. But nothing was ever proven. Now, Mac dismounted and helped Juniper down. Her face looked pale under the rising sun, and her eyes darted back and forth, watching every movement, as if expecting something bad to leap from the shadows. "This way," Mac said softly, motioning her toward the dark. Inside, the air turned cold and damp. The first chamber was wide, with old wooden crates and rusted tools scattered like bones. A few narrow tunnels shot off deeper into the earth. Juniper clutched his hand tightly as they stepped farther in. He set down his saddlebag and lit a lantern, letting the light fill the space. Despite the cold and the dust, it felt strangely safe. Cut off from the world, hidden, silent. "We'll rest here a while," he said. "No one'll find us easy." Juniper nodded but said nothing. She walked quietly to one of the far walls where an old cot sat, half collapsed against the rock. She sat beside it and stared at something half buried in the dust. Mac walked over, crouched beside her. It was a toy. A wooden horse, faded and cracked, but still standing. Its painted mane chipped, one ear broken. Carved along the bottom, in uneven but careful letters, was a name. Carlos. Juniper looked up at him, voice barely above a whisper. This was his? Mac stared at the name, the weight of it crashing down. Carlos was Maria's boy. Vanished 2 winters ago. Sheriff claimed he ran off, but she never believed it. Neither did Mac. He picked up the horse gently, brushing dirt from the carved name, his jaw tightening. He was here. Juniper's hands trembled slightly. She didn't cry, didn't ask. She just placed the horse beside her like it belonged to her now, too, like they shared something. Hours passed. Mac cleaned out the front chamber, blocking the entrance with branches and canvas. He set up bedrolls, placed his rifle within reach. When the lantern dimmed, he lit another. Then came the voices, not threatening, but cautious. From outside, near the ridge, Mac moved fast, gun drawn, shielding Juniper with his body. But when the figure stepped into the light, he froze. 3 of them. A man with a limp, maybe in his 50s, a younger woman, no more than 20, clutching a photograph, and an old man with a weathered face and a pair of heavy boots that had seen more walking than rest. "We heard you were out here," the limping man said. "Name's Tom Ellis. My daughter vanished 3 months ago." Nobody listened. The young woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "My sister, 2 years ago. Took her from school. Sheriff said she ran off with some man. She wouldn't." The old man held up a necklace, just a string of beads. "My grandson, Marcus, gone since last spring." Mac stood silent as more arrived, one by one. By sunset, 7 families had gathered near the mouth of the cave, none of them shouting, none demanding anything, just searching. Word had spread like wildfire pushed by desert wind that Mac Whitaker had returned, that he'd found a girl, that the old mine might hold answers. He didn't ask how they knew. He didn't need to. Pain like this finds its own signal. Maria came too. When she saw the wooden horse, she fell to her knees, held it like it was bone from a grave. Her sobs echoed off stone. Juniper watched them all from the corner, knees drawn to her chest. She didn't move, didn't speak, until night fell and most of the voices died down into murmurs and silence. Then she turned to Mac, eyes wide and hollow. "They'll come for me. The bad men. They always come." Mac crouched beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "They'll have to come through me first." He stood, his voice carrying through the cavern as the lantern flames flickered. "I don't know everything yet, but I know what I've seen. I know this girl's not the only one, and I know I ain't gonna run anymore." The others watched him. Some nodded. Others cried. No one left. For the first time in years, Mac Whitaker felt something settle in his chest that wasn't rage or guilt, it was purpose. And he knew next time they came, he'd be waiting, rifle loaded, heart ready. The next morning dawned heavy with tension. The old silver mine that had once echoed with pickaxes and curses now filled with whispers, footsteps, and quiet prayers. The families who'd gathered weren't ready to leave. Something had shifted the night before. Mac felt it. So did Juniper. Mac stood at the cave's mouth, sipping bitter coffee brewed over a fire pit. The desert beyond was pale pink and gold, but his mind was elsewhere, on names, on stories, on what the sheriff was hiding. He didn't hear the footsteps until the voice cut through the stillness behind him. "Mr. Whitaker." He turned. The woman was no taller than Juniper, wiry but sharp-eyed, with a black shawl wrapped tight around her head. Her voice carried a strange mix of fear and defiance. "Name's Elena Vasquez," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I clean for the mayor, and I listen." Max stepped aside to let her in, his gaze steady but unreadable. She clutched her small purse like it might burst if she let it go. "They're planning something," she said, eyes darting around the cave. "A big event. 2 nights from now, at the old chapel outside town. Not for worship, for selling. The mayor's wife is handling the invitations. She thinks the world owes her since they couldn't have children." Juniper, who had been curled near the fire with the wooden horse in her lap, looked up. "Selling what?" Mac asked, though he already knew. "Kids." Elena's voice cracked, and she swallowed. "All dressed up like they're dolls. Bidders come from out of state. They leave before sunrise, always in wagons with curtains." The room went still. Juniper slowly rose and walked toward the group. Her steps were soft, but her eyes were resolute. "I have something," she whispered. She reached into her satchel, the old one Maria had given her, stitched and patched 100 times over. From inside, she pulled a ragged cloth doll. Its arms were frayed, the left eye was missing, but the stitching down the back was fresh, new thread against the faded body. Juniper looked up at Mac, then turned and carefully undid the stitches. Inside, folded so many times it looked like a scrap of nothing, was a piece of paper. Mac unfolded it slowly. 12 names, all in a child's handwriting. Wobbly letters, some letters backward, some crossed out and rewritten. At the top, in shaky, careful scrawl, "Do not forget." Below that, Ava, Nico, Rosalie, Marta, Toby. And near the bottom, Mac's eyes locked onto a name that made the blood drain from his face. Emma Rose Hartwell, age 8, the world tilted. He hadn't spoken that name in almost 20 years, couldn't bear to. Emma, his daughter, the little girl who'd vanished when the fire took his home, his wife, everything. The town said she'd been burned beyond recognition. Sheriff filed it as a death. Case closed. But her body was never found. Mac stumbled back a step. His hands trembled as he held the paper. The letters blurred. Not from age, from the storm behind his eyes. Juniper's voice came again, soft. I didn't know if the names were real, but I kept it hidden, in case I ever found someone who could stop them. Mac knelt, his massive frame suddenly looking worn, brittle. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She pointed to the back of her leg, under a scarred patch of skin. "That's where they tattooed my number. One night I snuck into their office, took the list, hid it in my doll. Emma." Mac said the name like it hurt, to breathe. He stood, the paper still clutched in his hand, heart thundering in his chest. Elena's face turned pale as she realized what he was thinking. "Wait, you think she's—" "I don't know," Mac growled, "but if there's even a sliver of truth in this, I'll burn that chapel to the ground to find out." Juniper looked up, fear creeping in. "If they know I have that paper, they'll come sooner." Mac turned toward the others. Maria, the families, even the silent watchers in the shadows of the mine. "I need help. I need lookouts. I need eyes on every trail." He looked back down at the list. "And if Emma's alive, I'm bringing her home." Juniper stepped closer and tugged at his coat. "They'll try to stop you." "Let them try," Mac said, voice gravel and bare. "They don't know who they stole from, and they don't know what's coming for them." Elena Vasquez had never broken the law in her life. She crossed herself every Sunday, paid her debts, took care of her mother till the old woman passed. But that night, as she stood outside the back door of Judge Finch's estate with a lockpick in one hand and her rosary in the other, she whispered a prayer that sounded more like a curse. "Please forgive me, Mama, but the law ain't the law anymore." The judge's home was dark except for the dim flicker of oil lamps inside. The staff was gone for the weekend. Finch liked to drink alone when no one could see him wobble. Elena had cleaned his house enough to know his habits, his hiding spots, and where he kept the real secrets behind the study wall, in a drawer disguised to look like part of the floor molding. Her fingers worked fast. She was small, quick, forgotten. The kind of woman powerful men overlooked. That suited her just fine. Inside the drawer was a stack of ledgers, a box marked Archives, and one red file, frayed at the edges, with a sticker across the top. Witness hold. Internal use only. She opened it, hands trembling. Inside were photos, receipts, shipment logs, names, age, sale dates, buyers. The first page nearly made her gag. Emma Catherine McClum, age 7, sold to J. Whitmore, St. Helena Parish. Then another entry, Catherine Whitaker, deceased. Cause, fire. Location, Homestead Ridge. Notes, died resisting property seizure. Elena gasped. Her knees buckled and she braced herself against the desk. This wasn't just a record of crimes, it was a ledger of lies. And Mac Whitaker had been at the center of a storm that he'd never even seen coming. She stuffed the file into her dress and slipped out the way she came, heart pounding like hooves on dry earth. By dawn, she was back at the mine, dusty, scratched, and shaking. Maria ran to meet her. "Elena! Dios mío, what happened?" Elena held up the file. "Just take me to Mac." He was seated near the fire, oil-stained fingers twisting the handle of a blade he'd been sharpening all night. The list with Emma's name sat folded in his coat pocket, close to his heart. When Elena handed him the file, she didn't speak. She just nodded once and backed away. Mac opened it slowly, as if some part of him already knew what waited inside. Emma Catherine McClum, not Hartwell, not buried, sold. He read the name again, then the date, then the buyer. He read about Catherine, his Catherine, the woman he'd buried in pieces after the fire. He'd thought it was an accident, thought it was grief and madness that drove her to disappear that day, searching for Emma. But it wasn't madness, it was truth. She died trying to save their daughter. And the sheriff, the judge, the whole damn town let him believe otherwise. Mac's chest heaved. He looked around at the cave, at the other families, at Maria comforting Elena, at the children huddled near the fire. Juniper approached quietly. She had been sitting with her doll again, restitching the torn seam. "You okay?" she asked softly. He couldn't answer. His mouth worked, but no words came. The silence was thicker than the desert night. "I think you should read this," Juniper said. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was yellowed with age, ink faded but still legible. It was a birth record. Mac stared at it. Mother, Emma Catherine McClum. Father, unknown. Daughter, Juniper. Elise. His throat clenched. His eyes searched hers, desperate for something: confirmation, denial, anything. "Emma's my mama," Juniper said gently. "She died when I was 6. I don't remember much, just a lullaby she used to hum, and that she called me her little pine tree." Mac closed his eyes. Juniper, a name for something tough, rooted, quiet, a name his daughter would have chosen. His hands shook as he reached for her, brushing the girl's cheek with the back of his fingers. "You're my granddaughter." Juniper didn't move, just nodded. "I think I've always known, somehow." Mac pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. And for the first time in 2 decades, the giant cowboy wept, not just for what was taken, but for what had been found again. He held her tighter. "I lost Emma. I won't lose you." Juniper nodded against his chest. "Then you better get ready," she whispered, "because they're coming. And they know we know." By the time the sun crested over the ridge, the old mine had turned into a war room. Word had spread like wildfire through the cracks and tunnels, passed in whispers between mothers, fathers, cousins, and kin. The kind of news that didn't need to be shouted, just shared quietly, like an ember passed hand to hand, burning hot beneath the surface. They had the names. They had the place. They had the date. And for the first time, they had a shot. Elena laid the stolen documents out across a wide wooden table. Yellowing paper, ink smudged from her fingers, but the words were clear. 23 children, she said, held in the basement of the old mission church, being transferred during the auction. That's tomorrow at sundown. Father Miguel crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish under his breath. Then he looked up, eyes sharper than anyone had ever seen on a man of the cloth. "They chose a holy place for unholy things," he said. "We'll make sure they regret that." Mac stood at the head of the table, arms folded across his chest. The fire behind him made the scars on his neck look darker, deeper. His silence was no longer quiet. It was heavy, magnetic. Every eye turned to him. "We don't get a second chance," he said finally. "They're expecting no one. So we'll give them everyone." Elena pointed to a sketch she'd made of the church layout from memory. She'd cleaned that place often in her younger days. "There's a servant's entrance on the east side. I can get inside dressed as a cleaner." "They won't blink," Mac nodded. "That's our eyes on the inside." Father Miguel spoke next. I still have blasting powder from the mining days, stored under the altar at San Esteban's. I'll bring enough to open the rear wall. It'll create chaos and a way out. Maria leaned forward. We'll need wagons. Covered ones, enough for the children and any wounded. I'll get Reuben and Elias. They're quiet and know the hill roads. We need distractions, Mac said. Start fires in the fields. Something to pull their security thin. 2 men to each flank. No gunshots unless it's the only way. Juniper sat quietly, doll in her lap, listening harder than any adult in the room. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the stitched hem where the names had been hidden. Mac glanced at her. You okay, kid? She nodded, but her voice came out small. They'll have guards. With guns and dogs. What if they hurt the little ones before we get in? Mac squatted beside her, took both her hands in his. That's not gonna happen. You hear me? She looked up at him. How do you know? He looked around the room. These weren't soldiers. They were miners, cooks, stable hands, school teachers, and one scarred preacher with a flask in his sleeve. But their faces were carved with something older than fear resolve. Because we've got something they don't, Max said. We've got the truth. And we've got each other. He pulled Juniper into his arms. She clung to him, tighter than ever. You said your mama used to tell you stories, he murmured into her hair, that she believed her daddy would come save her one day. Juniper nodded. Well, tell her she was right. That day is tomorrow. Her breath caught, and for the first time since she came into his life, she smiled, not like a child learning to trust, but like someone remembering who she came from. As the group broke into teams, Elena pulled Maria aside. There's something else, she whispered. The mayor's name. His son is listed on the buyer log. He's in deep. Maria cursed under her breath. Then we don't just take back the children. We burn the whole rotten tree down. Mac moved through the group like a quiet force, giving out roles, checking supplies, asking no more of anyone than they were willing to give. But when he came back to Father Miguel, his voice lowered. Can you still read from the book? He asked. The priest looked surprised. Why? Because when this is over, Mac said, we'll need someone to bury the past and bless the new. They made their final plans in the low light, under the hush of wind through the rocks. Tomorrow they would walk into hell, but tonight they lit their own fire. Mac adjusted the rifle's scope and wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. The heat had settled like a weight on his back, and the dust itched beneath his collar. But none of that mattered, not with what he was seeing. Across the dry gulch and through the cracked stained glass window of the old mission church, he saw movement. A woman appeared, leading a small group of children down the side aisle, her steps steady despite the iron collar locked around her neck. Her blonde hair was matted but unmistakable. She held one child's hand in hers, another clinging to her apron. His heart stopped. Emma. For 20 years he'd believed she was dead. His little girl, stolen in the dark, had vanished without a trace. And yet there she was, older now, but not broken. Even from this distance, Mac could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving, she was protecting. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. Juniper was crouched beside him in the sagebrush, knees scraped and doll clutched tight. That's her, she whispered. That's my mama. Mac swallowed hard, his vision blurred, not from the sun, but from something deeper. You sure? Juniper nodded. She sings to me in the dark. Same as she did in that place. Even when they hurt her, she sang behind them. Ruth adjusted her scope. Joseph loaded another round into his rifle. Elena, now dressed in a nun's habit, stolen from a storage closet in town, had already slipped into position near the servant entrance. Inside her pouch was the ignition cord, 3 feet of fuse, soaked in kerosene and wrapped in wax paper. Father Miguel stood behind them all, cradling a satchel of explosives like a prayer book. Mac turned to the group. "They're all in place?" he asked. Maria nodded. "Wagons are waiting behind the hills. Reuben and Elias will come at the first signal." Mac stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, then checked the revolvers strapped to his thighs. His voice dropped low and quiet. "Every child in there belongs to us. If not by blood, then by duty. Today we bring them home." He didn't wait for a reply. He moved. The plan unfolded like smoke, quiet at first, then roaring. Elena lit the fuse behind the rectory wall and ducked out of sight. Ruth and Joseph took their marks on opposite ends of the ridge, their rifles resting on saddle blankets for stability. The explosion ripped through the east wing like thunder, bricks and beams collapsing in a roar. Screams echoed, followed by shouts and gunfire from inside. Mac was already running. He barreled through the breach with a fury not seen since the war. One man lunged at him. Mac hit him with the butt of his rifle so hard the man crumpled like paper. Inside the sanctuary, chaos ruled. Masked men screamed orders, trying to herd terrified children. But Emma stepped in front of them, arms outstretched like a mother shielding her brood from a wildfire. "No," she shouted. "You don't touch them." One of the guards raised a whip. Before it landed, a bullet tore through his hand, dropped him screaming. Joseph, from the North Ridge. Mac burst into the nave and locked eyes with Emma. She stared, stunned, her breath hitching. "Dad?" He nodded just once. "I'm here." Juniper darted through the smoke and pews, running straight into her mother's arms. "Mama!" Emma collapsed to her knees, wrapping her daughter tight. "You found me," she whispered through tears. "No," Juniper said. "Grandpa did." Mac turned to the crowd of children still huddled, sobbing. He raised his voice, the boom of it echoing against the stone walls. "Every one of you is going home today. You're not forgotten. You're not lost. You're ours." A final wave of guards surged in from the rear. Ruth and Father Miguel flanked them, rifles blazing. Elena smashed open the back doors with a crowbar, and daylight flooded in. Wagons rolled up, families poured out. One by one, the children were lifted, carried, shielded, and guided into the arms of those who waited. Not everyone had someone waiting, but that didn't matter. Strangers held them like kin. Tears blurred the lines of blood. In the smoke and fire, Mac pulled the collar off Emma's neck with bolt cutters he'd carried all this way. She gasped as it clanged to the ground. "You were just a kid," he said, brushing her hair from her face. "I'm so sorry." Emma took his hand. "You came." That's all I ever needed, sirens, distant and growing. Elena stepped forward, breathless. "They've called in the sheriff's men." And maybe more. Mac looked to the horizon. "We've only just begun." The air inside the church was thick with smoke and gunpowder. Ash floated like snow through the golden light pouring from shattered, stained glass. But time slowed as Sheriff Murdoch stepped from the shadows of the altar, revolver raised, the barrel pressed against Emma's temple. Her hands were in the air. She stood between him and the children, her body shaking, but her voice steady. "You'll have to shoot me in front of them," she said. Murdoch grinned. "I was planning to." Behind the pews, Mac froze. His rifle was lowered. He was too far for a clean shot, and Murdoch knew it. The bastard held his ground, sweat running down his face, finger tightening on the trigger. Juniper, still clutching her doll, stepped from behind a bench. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mama!" Emma's knees nearly buckled. The sound of her daughter's voice, clear, alive, brave, hit her like thunder. Tears spilled from her eyes as she turned slightly, just enough to see Juniper standing there, cheeks smudged with dirt, but her chin high. Murdoch flicked his aim toward the girl. Get back, or—" Emma didn't hesitate. With a scream, she slammed her elbow into his arm, knocking the gun upward. The shot rang out and shattered the crucifix above, wood raining down from the ceiling. She twisted and shoved him backward into the pulpit. Mac moved like lightning. He dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired. The bullet hit Murdoch square in the chest. The sheriff gasped, staggered, and fell. His revolver clattered to the ground, echoing off the stone floor. Emma dropped beside Juniper and wrapped her arms around her so tightly the girl squeaked, then giggled, then sobbed. "Are you hurt?" Emma asked frantically. "No, you saved me. You saved everybody all around them." Children were emerging from behind pews, corners, and crates. Dozens of small faces, frightened, pale, some bruised, looked to one another and then to the back of the church. That's when something extraordinary happened. One small boy, no older than 7, ran to a rusted cage in the corner where 4 other children were locked inside. He reached through the bars and grabbed the key from Murdoch's belt where it had fallen. His hands trembled, but he got the lock open. The other children spilled out, embracing him, crying and laughing. Another girl, tall and thin, darted to the second cage. A younger child handed her the bolt cutters Mac had used earlier. She strained, struggled, and finally snapped the chain. More children were freed, and still more. They weren't waiting for adults anymore. They opened every cage, they cut ropes, they pulled blankets off the tied up. They helped each other, touched bruises, wiped tears. Ruth ran in and stopped, stunned. "They're doing it themselves," she whispered. Father Miguel fell to his knees, crossing himself. "God is watching." Mac holstered his gun and walked toward the front of the church. Murdoch's body lay still, face twisted in disbelief. The man who thought himself the hand of law now looked no different than the floor he bled on. He turned to the children. "Listen up," he said, voice deep and calm. "The people who built these cages want you to believe you're weak. They want you to wait for someone else to save you." He looked at the little boy still holding the cage key. "But you already did it." The boy looked up. "We just wanted to go home." Mac nodded. "Then we'll get you there." Outside, the sound of horses and wagons grew louder. More families arriving. Armed townsfolk. The wind carried word of what happened like wildfire, and the fire was righteous. Joseph helped lift a small girl from the broken cage. She looked up at him and asked, "Are you the sheriff now?" He smiled. "I don't know, honey. Guess we'll see what the people say." Elena grabbed a burning candle from the altar and lit a lantern near the door. Its light cut through the smoke, guiding the families who began flooding in, calling names, crying out, dropping to their knees as they found their sons and daughters. Some children had no family to call back to, but they stood tall anyway, holding hands. Juniper took her mother's hand and tugged her toward the doors. "What happens now?" Emma looked at the chaos behind them, the broken chains, the cages torn apart by tiny hands. "Now," she said, "now we make sure it never happens again." But as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon and the people began to gather, a figure appeared on horseback alone, dressed in black, riding hard through the smoke. Maria's face went pale. "That's Judge Hollingsworth." Mac's eyes narrowed. Then the real war's about to begin. 6 months had passed since the dust settled, since the church was stormed, since a dozen cages were torn apart by children's hands, and a crooked sheriff was buried without ceremony under a nameless stone. The land had turned green again, not just with spring, but with something deeper, something harder to describe. A kind of stillness like the earth itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Out where the prairie met the cottonwoods, the old farmhouse stood again rebuilt from its ashes, not to match what it once was, but to become what it needed to be now. The walls were sturdy, The porch deep, the roof slanted just right to catch the morning light. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. Mac stood on that porch, one boot up on the rail, hammer in hand. The sun spilled across his shoulders, catching in the silver strands of his beard. A little boy, no more than 2, all curls and giggles, tottered toward him, arms by. "Papa Mac!" the boy called. Mac dropped his hammer without thinking and scooped the child up into his arms. He tossed him gently into the air and caught him with a laugh so deep it echoed off the barn. Emma stepped out from the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She leaned against the doorframe and watched them, arms folded, eyes full of something that hadn't been there before: peace. Maria came around the corner with a basket of laundry, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her scars were still visible, but they were no longer the first thing people saw. She called out, "That boy's going to get spoiled with the way you carry on." Mac grinned. "He's my grandson." Spoiling him is my job. In the backyard, Juniper was digging in the garden with 2 other children, one missing a front tooth, the other clutching a hand-carved doll. They looked like they'd always been siblings, dirt on their hands, freedom in their eyes. The house was full now, not just with bodies, but with noise, with stories, with memory and forgiveness and second chances. Inside, up in the attic, Juniper had found something remarkable a few days ago, a small wooden rocking horse, worn smooth with age. Emma had gasped when she saw it. "I thought that was long gone," she whispered. "Mama used to set me on it every morning while she cooked." They dusted it off and placed it in the corner of the front room. Now every child took turns riding it, as if passing on something sacred, a piece of Emma's past rethreaded into their future. One evening, as the sky turned the color of apricots and the breeze swayed the tall grass like hymn music, they all sat on the porch together. Mac in his chair, Emma beside him, Juniper curled up with a quilt across her knees. The little boy tugged at Mac's vest and asked quietly, "Papa Mac, are we going home?" Mac didn't answer right away. He looked at the sun dropping low behind the barn, the windmill creaking gently, and the dozens of shoes lined up by the front door. He glanced at Emma, who took his hand and squeezed. "Yes, sweetheart," Mac said at last, voice gravelly but full of warmth. "We already are." They sat in that silence a while, the kind that only families earn. But beyond the fields, beyond the fences, beyond the line where the stars would soon begin to shimmer, trouble stirred in the towns that still hadn't changed. Men like Murdoch weren't born from nothing. They were shaped by systems, funded by power, covered by robes and titles. There were others out there, other children, other mothers, other battles waiting. And Mac had just begun to hear their calls. So had Maria. So had Emma. And Juniper. She was already drawing maps on scrap paper, planning safe houses and supply trails like a little general in boots too big for her feet. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a legacy. One rebuilt not from stone, but from courage, from kindness, from fire. And if you've walked this far with us, friend, don't turn away now. Subscribe to Western Legacy, because out here, the West ain't just wild, it's rising.